Hello, everyone. Welcome to The Reason We Learn. I'm your host, Deb Philman. At The Reason We Learn, we aspire to be part of the solution. The purpose of this show is to take a good, honest, potentially painful look at the way kids are being educated. We know we can do better, and this is where we'll talk about how. Let's learn something. Hi, everybody. Welcome to The Reason We Learn. I'm your host, Deb Philman. I'm so glad you're here. I have a great show planned for you today. And so before I get started, I'd like to ask you to please consider subscribing to the channel and click the notification bell to be notified when I make new content. Please also like and share this broadcast with others so they can benefit from the information we are about to share. Today, I am fortunate enough to have somebody here who represents an EdTech company. I talk a lot about EdTech on the channel, but I rarely get the opportunity to talk to someone who's in that field. Brian Curcio has always been fascinated with the world of investing. He developed Rapunzl as a financial literacy EdTech tool to revolutionize how we teach students about investing and to provide equitable access to high-quality project-based learning tools for students across the country. Now, I've said a lot of words there that those of you who follow me might say, well, Deb, what do you think about this? I'm glad you asked. I'm going to be asking him some of the questions that we parents have about EdTech, and he will be answering them so you can make up your own minds. He's here to discuss the state of financial education in the United States, how he envisions enhancing it. And I'm so grateful to him for spending the time. So please join me in welcoming Brian Curcio. Hi, Brian.
Hey, thanks for having me.
You're so welcome. So very quickly, tell us a little bit about your background and how you decided to get involved in education about financial literacy.
Sure. So kind of started early on. I grew up, both my parents were trained accountants that ended up being investment bankers. And around the time that I was in middle school, my mom made the switch and was helping run a therapeutic day school in Chicago. And so I helped out a lot with that and was always really involved. And so that was kind of where my passion for this education and finance came. And then around senior year of college, Robinhood started gaining a lot of popularity with all the meme stock craziness. And it became really apparent that so many of our peers were getting started investing for the first time, but really didn't know what they were doing. And so that was where the idea for creating an app where students could learn about financial markets in a risk-free environment kind of was born.
Cool. So you and I believe another person created Rapunzl?
My partner, Miles. So we met freshman year of high school, actually. Our lockers were like 3 apart. And so we were 2 of the few kids in our class that were really interested in investing at a really young age.
That's unusual. I think a lot of people watching might be thinking, wow, you guys were interested in investing at a young age. But what do you see today when you sort of scan the horizon of education in terms of kids' awareness of money, how it works, investing, and all that?
It's scary, I think. I think that there's statistics that it's about the average person in the US self-reports that they have about $1,800 in losses due to the lack of financial literacy. And when you look at how many Americans are so close to the poverty line, I mean, I think that, yes, it's impacting all Americans, I think. And these ideas that you can get a credit card without understanding how credit works, or that the dream is that everyone should own a home, but you never really learn about how mortgages work in school. I think it's slowly starting to shift in some states. There's been financial literacy as a high school graduation requirement, but I think it's kind of like the legislators have wiped their hands of it. They've like, okay, we passed the bill, but no one's really thinking about the catch-22 you have, that if you've never taught financial literacy before, who's going to teach financial literacy now? And so I think we see a disconnect where students aren't necessarily receiving it, but a lot of times the teachers never received that same information.
We're noticing that with reading, history, and science too. But anyway, I digress.
Right. So I think that's where we've been working a lot. And so I think one of the things we found was, instead of just teaching financial literacy, we have financial math that's looking more at middle school students, because we realized that a lot of high schools, particularly in Chicago, where we started Rapunzl, the high school students need remedial math as well. And so trying to find ways that I've yet to find a job that you can have where they don't make you pay taxes. And so it's kind of like reading, writing, arithmetic, and taxes should be things that are taught to all students, is kind of our belief.
Yeah. Maybe if they knew more about it, they would be, more frustrated about having to pay them, right?
Oh, that's don't get me started.
That's what I've always thought, but they joke about that first paycheck you get from your first job. You're like, who's FICO?
Exactly.
So I've heard that, by the way, from students in the past. So you created Rapunzl. I'm going to bring it up on the screen. I want to show the audience kind of what the website looks like, and they'll get a sense of sort of the screens. You have Bring Financial Literacy to Life. So now, would this be delivered strictly on, so this is on devices, of course, so on a phone or a desktop or laptop, or does it have to be?
Correct. So it's a phone, tablet, or a laptop. And so the way we've split it out is there's a student-facing portion, and then there's a educator-facing side of the platform. And so students receive $10,000 in a fictional stock portfolio, and then they're able to buy and sell companies in real time as if it were a real portfolio. And we've put a bunch of the educational resources into the platform itself, but the heart of it is the educator dashboard that then houses our full middle and high school curriculum, and so allows instructors to kind of follow how students are performing, see what trades they're making in their portfolios, and kind of get a high level overview of the class.
Right. So now I notice here you were a 2022 YAS Prize finalist. So I'm wondering if you could tell us about what the YAS Prize is and what we need to know about that.
Yeah. So, I mean, the YAS Prize really kind of transformed the trajectory for Rapunzl. And it was part of the YAS Prize's Stop Awards. And so the Stop Awards were started during COVID, and it was really looking at all of these different professions that were getting recognized for being frontline responders and nurses. But a lot of the time looking at educators weren't celebrated, and we're kind of trying to hold schools together even as they were being closed and whatnot. And so these awards were started to really recognize those educators, and these Stop Awards are centered around the principles of sustainable, transformational, outstanding, and permissionless, and really recognizing that education's happening now. And I think a lot of the failings that we're reading about in the traditional school system are going to require people taking really bold action, and then also a lot of money supporting those initiatives. So I think the YAS Prize has given about $30 million away each of the last 3 years. And they actually do a annual application for educators across the country. And that application opened for 2024. So it's available for homeschools, micro schools, charter, traditional public, EdTech companies, advocacy groups, really across the board, just people who are disrupting the status quo which is pretty abysmal, as you know.
So now I'm curious, when you say, people who are disrupting and building and so on, does that mean that this is like trying to encourage people to build almost like an alternative marketplace for education? Or
yes,
are they
trying to,
okay.
Yeah, and really trying to give parents more options and more choice. And so I was one of 9 finalists. I mean, one of the finalists was this Dr. Corey Steiner from Northern Cass School District, which is a rural public school district in North Dakota, but really looking at competency-based learning and grading. And then everything from like a Kai Pod, which helped parents set up micro schools in their own communities. So it's really expansive. And then there was traditional chartered schools as well. And there was so I think that it really varies. It's just trying to look at kind of what's creating outstanding outcomes for kids.
I see. And where do you know where the funding comes from for the prize itself?
Jeff and Janine Yas.
Oh, okay. I'm not familiar with them.
So they've been huge philanthropists across the country. I think I know that they're based in Philadelphia. And Jeffrey Yass was one of the founders of Susquehanna Capital, the finance firm. And so, yeah, they've been, I think for the past 30 years, they've been kind of supporting education initiatives across the country.
I see. And do you know, as far as one of the concerns that my audience has is that a lot of the companies that you're talking about, even the micro schools and things that are coming up, like people hear about it and they get super excited because it does seem to represent a true alternative, like something away from the government system that's, innovative, all the things that make America great. Entrepreneurs, people just saying, we're going to solve this problem. Let's roll up our sleeves. Let's go. And then they start hearing about things like ESAs or vouchers, or which are government. I mean, it's coming out of the so-called ed dollars, education dollars from taxpayers, that companies that are doing this will be may be eligible to use, and parents start getting nervous. Some parents love it. Some parents think that's great. It's going to even make it better. We'll have so many more choices. And then there are other people who look at the past where government's gotten involved in the private sector and see regulations and strings attached. And so what's your take on that as far as how these new companies, even how Rapunzl, can maintain integrity in terms of what your mission is, what you want to do in the face of such a big temptation or, incentive to link arms with the government?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think that from my initial thoughts on it are that it's better than what it was before. So I think the idea of funding schools where the kids don't even attend those schools is nonsensical. And so I think that separating the funding where it's able to at least follow the students, I think is better. I agree that having the government kind of control and influence, just dealing with, it took us 6 years to be an approved vendor in Chicago, even though we had given kids in Chicago public school scholarships before. So I think that the government bureaucracy and oversight piece is such a huge hindrance, I think, in education innovation. The challenge is that if we do want to leverage technology in the classroom, we have a tough situation where most EdTech VCs or kind of large funders of for-profit companies don't want to fund education because they see this bureaucracy. And so it doesn't have the quick returns of getting in an Uber or a Facebook. And so when you have such limited access to capital to even start education initiatives, you are really dictated with like, okay, where is the money? And that's like, especially with technology, because it's really expensive. And so I think, I can't speak for any other ed tech companies, but at least with Rapunzl, it's like, we've always just tried to prioritize, like, we're going to be engaging students and it's going to be risk-free in a way like it would be if you had a real simulator. So ideas of like incorporating ads into the platform, like you don't have ads in your Robinhood account. Why would you have ads on Rapunzl? And so I think that's where we've tried to kind of make sure that you still stay ethically aligned with the students. And then also looking at the corporate funding side too. Like corporations have their own rules, I think, around funding, but they're a lot less stringent than government rules. And so we found a lot of success working with banks, and they've helped fund our scholarship competitions through this CRA funding, which came from the Community Reinvestment Act in 2008. And it was really looking at banks after the financial crisis and recognizing that a portion of their profits needs to be going back into the community. And so traditionally, CRA funding has been used for forgiving loans in minority communities or figuring out other kind of soft dollar expenses that they can put on the books. But we've presented to a lot of firms now where it's like, look, instead of making money on or having to deal with the fact that people don't understand these financial products, wouldn't it be better to take this money and invest it in education? And so
prevent the problem in the first place.
Exactly. And so there's some banks that, I mean, you can think through which firms benefit the most from a lack of financial intelligence. And so we don't necessarily work with those firms as much as some of the larger, more established major banks that are kind of just trying to encourage more individuals to understand the benefits of a savings account, bank account. And there might be a profit incentive for them in that,
Right.
but it's kind of the way, if you teach someone about investing and they don't want to open a brokerage account at the end of it, you probably didn't do a good enough job teaching them, is part of it. So I think that
Probably, yeah. That's
you
fair.
kind of need these firms to some extent, I think.
Right. I think where people may get frustrated is, and I bet the banks are frustrated too, is that something, again, like the CRA is essentially the government telling the banks how to do what they do. And I bet a lot of people would argue that part of why we got into the financial crisis in the first place was the government getting involved and telling them who to lend to, and how many loans they had to make and all things. So it, I think in education and certainly amongst my audience, the one source of frustration is that we keep that we keep trying to fix things and we're chasing our tails a little bit because government keeps coming in and go, oh yeah, about that thing that you're trying to do to fix it. Yeah, we need to have our say. And so unfortunately, companies like yours end up being on the receiving end of some of that frustration. Like, oh, these ed tech companies, like, well, some of them probably I wouldn't be too psyched to sit down and talk to. But then in your position, it's like, well, what do you want us to do? The government monopolizes the capital that's going into education. So it's like almost impossible to get your hands on it. They're forcing banks to spend money on something. Isn't it a better expense to put it into financial literacy than to just forgive loans? That seems like a moral hazard. So, I mean, it sounds like it's a real quandary for companies like yours.
Yeah, it's challenging. I think there's a few kind of the powers that be that are benefiting from maintaining the status quo. And I think that, I mean, it had devastating consequences, but at least now I think people are waking up post-COVID to recognizing that, I mean, in the past 15, 20 years, you've doubled the nation's spending on education and the results have gotten worse.
Exactly.
So in my mind, the ideal would be we go back to the levels of 20 years ago, give the extra money to the parents and let them pay for what solutions they want for their kids. I mean, it's kind of, it's like, that seems pretty easy.
Or if not give it, at least like let them not have it taken in the first place kind of thing, and start resetting the expectations that, you know, how you feed your kids and clothe your kids and put a roof over their head. Well, you know, you're going to also be responsible for making sure they get educated. Like, what do we do with them in the summer? So, they might be listening. But you know, there's not like a mandatory pay into it and use it summer camp, right? So we all have at least 2 months. We have to figure it out.
Right.
Just expand it by a few more. Is that not a few, but all, but you know what I'm saying? I think as a financial person, you know, somebody who's been like interested in money your whole life, what would you say to this? Like I've said when people ask me, isn't this better, this being having ESAs, for example, or having vouchers, where isn't it better than, or you know, what's your proposal instead of it? And my argument always has been open the market and let it work. Like we know there's a need. Kids have to get educated. Parents want them to get educated. You can still keep a law that says your kids can't be wandering around the streets all day. Like you can still have some kind of a where are you and where are you supposed to be law. So why not have, you know, why not just let the money and the marketplace work to fill the need? And people look at me like I have 3 heads. Do you think that's part of financial illiteracy too? That people kind of don't understand that there is an incentive to provide education amongst private sector individuals?
Yeah,
they don't believe me when I tell them that. And I'm like, why would
I
there
think
be?
Yeah, it's like it's financial literacy. I think it's also one of the greatest branding jobs. I mean, it's like, I think that, and I see it with nonprofits that we work with too. There's this idea that you're like schools and nonprofits aren't businesses. And that's really the core of it, where it's like, no, a school is a business and your customers are parents. You could say the customers are the kids, and it's like, but you try keeping the kid happy and not the parents and see how it works. So I think that schools across the board would benefit from looking at themselves more as businesses and how are we going to meet the needs of parents, I think. And I think that gets to the whole, right now, I think there's more meeting the needs of the legislators who don't actually send their kids to those schools even. But
that's right. Well, because the incentives shift, don't they, when it's public? In other words, when it's run by the government, the adults are the customers and the stakeholders, not the kids. The whole thing becomes kind of politically motivated, including the pile of money that's getting handed out. So even when you want to go into a school district, I imagine there are discussions back and forth that end up at some point being of a political nature,
Right.
because they have, explain to the audience how you go into school districts. So you were telling me before the show that the funding for what you do to go free into districts is provided by.
Yeah, so we receive a lot of funding from kind of financial institutions that'll fund us to work in low-income communities. And so, believe it or not, those are actually sometimes easier to make the connections because we work directly with teachers. And so that's one of the things that I really push back on in this education discourse is we've started demonizing teachers. And it's like the system that the teachers operate in is abysmal. But teachers are still there because they care about the kids. I mean, you get bad teachers, but by and large, and we're in a lot of classrooms. And I think that, so what we kind of receive funding from the banks to train the teacher on implementing the curriculum, providing the curriculum for free, and working with the students. And so those, I mean, we ran that program for 5 years without being approved by Chicago Public Schools main office. Not for lack of trying either. So there's a bureaucracy there, but even on the smaller level where we're kind of working with schools and having them pay for the curriculum, I mean, it's a multi-year process to kind of set up those contracts. And so that's where, even going back to the ESA funding, it's like, I think I'd love to take money from somewhere else. It would be great if there was another pot of money somewhere to be able to keep the lights on and pay the staff. But unfortunately there isn't. And so it's kind of like you have to make it work with the options that are available.
Right, right. So when it's in the low income district, the financial companies, the banks and so forth, have that CRA motivation to, you guys have to put money back in the community, so pay for Rapunzl, and there it is. In the districts that do not meet those criteria, they have to figure it into their budget, correct?
Right.
Okay. And so that's where I imagine you're competing. That's where the politics comes in. That's probably where you're competing with this SEL program or that DEI program or this mental health something, right?
Right. Yeah. And so that's where we've benefited, where we focused on states where personal finance has been made a requirement, because that happened recently enough that schools are really eagerly looking to fill that spot. And so that's helped. There's not much in terms of financial literacy that's out there that's actually quality, we found. But yeah, when you start talking about just different electives in general, it's unbelievable how quickly learning about money falls to the wayside.
Right, right. And, again, it's ironic because if the people making these budget decisions had better financial literacy skills, they're saying we need to make sure all the kids, are going to have a good start in life and feel like they belong and all this stuff. And like, they will if they have money, if they understand how to use money. But anyway, now I know that one of the things that's big right now too is sort of career and college readiness, 21st century skills, all of these things. And I think to a certain extent, your website even like touched on it. What do you think about that? Do you think that we push too many kids to go to college in the first place when it may or may not be a good financial decision? Like the financial literacy can help them make that decision.
I think the numbers prove that one.
Okay.
I mean, yeah, I think there's been this idea of, success means that your kid graduates from college. And then I remember it back in high school, there started being the new crowd of, no, you should go to trade schools. And everyone who pushed trade schools, it was unbelievable how kind of like politicians pushing public schools. It's like, yeah, but their kids went to college. It's like, okay, so it's something that other people should go do. So I think we're seeing the results. I mean, there was some study, I think it was 18 to 25-year-olds, and how they valued a college degree has plummeted and at its lowest levels in ages. And I think that, frankly, we always teach this idea of good versus bad debt. And it's like Amazon was in debt for 15, 20 years, and now it's one of the most profitable companies in the world. And so it's like understanding that college debt might not look as good as it did 20, 30 years ago. I think that at least a lot of the tech companies have started exploring hiring students or individuals that don't have college degrees.
Right.
And I think that when you look at the cost of it, I mean, being like $250,000, and it's like, and then trying to figure out how you're going to earn that back over your lifetime. I mean, I think that colleges not being on the hook for a portion of their graduate student loans has created this moral hazard that I don't necessarily know what you do with student loans as the crisis across the country, but I know that you have to address the like exponential costs as well.
Right. Exactly.
It's
I think it's something that we need to keep talking about around kids and, even like in their classrooms, because so many of the programs use the phrase career and college readiness, but they finish with college and there's all this like go to college. And we'll even see districts now where they have no one from the district proficient in reading, as an example. And yet, not only are 85% of them graduating with zero proficient in
right,
reading and math, but you look at the percentage who go on to college with the and it's still 50%. And where's the disconnect here?
right,
If you're not proficient in math, you have no business going to college, because the likelihood is that you're about to take on debt without having any comprehension of what you're about to do, because it's a rare
right.
person who can afford to just go to college, right?
Yeah. No, and I think we're just looking at the wrong outcomes with all of it. I think if we were looking at, rather than college matriculation or trades, it's like, how about household income at 25 and at 30? And I think you look at some of these other relevant life key like markers versus, okay, reading proficiency. I mean, kids have to read. Like it's kind of, and it's unbelievable how it's like now we're starting to criticize techniques. It's like, I don't know, it worked well. I can read. So I think
Right, exactly. Like,
stick with whatever I got.
well, chances are you probably learned with some kind of phonics,
Right.
or like sounded out with it. I mean, I'm oversimplifying, but yeah, when they switched over to the whole word model, everything went awry. So they are trying to go back to that now a little bit, but you have teachers who were never trained to
Yeah. It's
use phonics. So, like you said about financial literacy, if the teachers aren't trained, then you have this whole other hurdle with it. So, getting back to like the Yas Prize, and you were mentioning about people are really concerned about what is, they want to build other stuff. To the extent that they get involved in, I don't know, like working with legislators or working with, or are they even doing that? For example, are you guys doing that to an extent where you speak to, at least, I'm not talking about lobbying, but like speak to people in public policy about how these things get paid for, or do you not? Is it like kind of, no, we're just doing our product, and which is totally
we
fine. I'm
haven't
just wondering.
focused on, yeah, we haven't focused on it. I think that we've just been focused on getting it out into more schools, but the
I
Yas
see.
Prize did help open like an incredible number of doors in that capacity. So I know we went to the Capitol and met with a lot of legislators probably in March of last year. And then we had sit downs in Oklahoma City with Governor Stitt. We were in Des Moines, Iowa with Governor Hobbs. So they've helped. And so Rapunzl hasn't necessarily benefited from those as much as some of the other organizations, but like there's one, Oakmont Education, that does dropout recovery schools for 18 to 28-year-olds, I believe. And it was just in Ohio, and Yas helped connect them. And so now they're launching with a couple campuses in Iowa this next school year. So they do help with the policy, and it seems to be the next step for Rapunzl as well, is starting to have those conversations. But yeah, it's just how close do you want to get to lobbying? I don't know.
No, I mean, and that's the problem, isn't it? And that's one of the things that feeds the skepticism amongst my audience members, is they will then look at the private sector companies that are trying to come in and, let's give them all the benefit of the doubt that everybody's got the best of intentions, right? Trying to kind of get into education where the money is, as you pointed out, which is in mostly the public sector that's got a monopoly on it, even to distribute to private. So there's where it is. And the the people who are going to schmooze the politicians a little more and get into hire lobbyists or become lobbyists, whatever, are probably going to get more attention and probably going to get into more schools than the people who want to just be like, no, we just want to be purchased on our merits and we don't really want to be like schmoozing the politicians. And it's all of this to me is saying, like, I hope the audience is watching and listening and hearing, wow, having a monopoly really makes things hard. You could be like the most well-intentioned creator and builder of alternatives, and you're just going to keep bumping into that wall that you have to figure out, how do I do this and get to the students and meet the demand that's there. The demand is there. But how do I get there? Like 6 years you said it took to get the approval?
Uh-huh. There's truly, I mean, there's better districts. I will say a lot of districts have been a lot better. And everyone we speak to in education was like, why would you start this in Chicago? It's like, I don't know. We grew up here. But
I mean, that makes sense. You're right there. It's like, you'd want to be able to like walk and meet the principals in the school and all that and the superintendents. You don't, why wouldn't you start there?
Yeah, exactly. But I will say it's been challenging. Even just turnover in schools is also, it's like you don't have a point of contact a lot of years. So it's just rebuilding those relationships year after year has been tough as well.
Yeah, the incentives are just very different in the public sector than in the private sector. And unfortunately in education, even the private sector is a little bit the public sector, right? Because parents who go over there, they're leaving money behind, right? Which is one problem. So they don't have as much money and they're like getting their hands on capital. And then if they get it back, it's coming with strings attached. Right. So it's a challenge. All right. Finally, the last thing I wanted to touch on was you mentioned before we start talking about how, because I asked you about SDG goals, the Sustainable Development Goals that are coming from UNESCO, WEF, and so forth, which the United States Department of Education under Joe Biden has pretty much signed on to. Like, yes, we want our education system to be oriented towards teaching the kids that they need to meet these goals in their lives. And you mentioned you weren't super familiar with that, but you were familiar with ESG for the banks, right?
Right.
And so what can you tell us about how that is influencing your work and the banks and the partnerships that you're trying to form?
Yeah, so it varies a little. I mean, I think ESG over the past 20 years has gotten a huge rise in popularity across financial institutions. I think that if you look into some of the way they're classifying ESG bonds, and particularly in developing countries and these green bonds, I think that there have been some really cool innovations on the side of like holding corporates, particularly out of like kind of Venezuela or South America, like holding these countries accountable, I think, on some of kind of destroying the rainforest. But I think to the same point, it's like whenever anything gets popular in finance, it then quickly becomes nonsensical, like mortgage-backed securities. And I think that it doesn't mean that mortgage-backed securities themselves were flawed as a product, but you have now, like, I think ESG has become a little too encompassing, where, I mean, Altria, like the cigarette company, has an A ESG score. And it's like, I don't know how. Like, which part? The product is meant to be burned. It destroys your lungs. It's not healthy. Yeah. And it's like, oh, but their corporate governance is exceptional because they have an extremely diverse board. And so I think that there's lots of studies that ESG forward companies outperform companies that don't adopt ESG standards. I haven't read too much into it, but I guess what I would say, it's strange. We have a module around ESG and social impact investing, and we teach it to the kids just because like this exists in the world of finance. And the ESG portion doesn't resonate as well. I think it's like, okay, so the companies are being environmentally friendly, or now we have kind of companies and their varying degree of how much they want to comment on social issues. But the piece that students actually really love is this idea that it's their money and their money has an influence. So it's not just like, oh, I can use my money to buy things. It's like, no, if you believe in this company and you support this company, then you can invest in it and the stock price will go up. And so I think this idea that, I don't know, it's like you can put your money where your mouth is, but also understanding their role in the economy. We try to spin it much more into that, and kind of like this Peter Lynch philosophy of buy the stocks you know and the companies you support all the time. Right. So we've tried to make it a more personal side of things versus framing everything under that new lens.
Yeah, well, because the kids are being taught that's a tough one because at the same time you want to make sure they understand profit and loss and that that reality doesn't change because you like an idea, right? And so we're going to be good to the environment. That's great. Do you make a product anyone wants? So
Right.
we right. So
Well, and so
the
we
kids.
try to highlight pieces where it's like, so we do a good case study. It was like 15 years ago, UPS did a big data mining of all of their driver routes. And someone came up with the idea that if you could avoid making left turns, you'd save 35% fuel on all your routes, and it ended up saving company hundreds of millions of dollars in fuel costs. And so trying to highlight that there's optimization that can help the environment and also help the bottom line. And so there's reason, like kind of giving new reasoning behind business operations versus drivers should take right turns and it has nothing. It's just because I think trying to
Right.
understand the why. Yeah.
Right. And, because I was going to say that students are being taught it as kind of a moral precept that, you have this obligation to social justice and to protect the environment. And, if you don't do those things, but we can't always, right? Like sometimes we have to invest in something that it just is. It's just a profitable company. And, that's how we're going to grow.
Right.
Now, because not every company has a big impact one way or the other. I mean, some do, some don't. But I just wonder, how much that's going into education is being put on kids through a political lens versus just hey, this is a new way to look at it. Like the way you just described it is a way that would appeal to me, right? I was like, well, of course. I was just talking yesterday. I did a show and I was talking about a little product that I bought. A little 28-year-old guy invented it. And it's all, compostable materials, all natural ingredient lip balm, et cetera. And I'm like, I'm going to buy that because I believe in what that guy's trying to do and in conservation and all that stuff. So yeah, of course, we make decisions like that, but then I still drive a gas powered car
Right.
because that's what I can afford, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So what I'm concerned about, a lot of parents are concerned about is the kids are being taught like it's bad morally to invest or, put your money in anything that isn't pure, like that isn't going
Right.
towards these things. And I think striking that balance, like how would you strike that balance or how do you strike the balance in the curriculum?
Yeah, I think we don't really look at it from a moral lens. I think it's kind of looking at it that this is another lens with which to view companies. You
I
can,
see. Okay.
and I think, but at the end of the day, like it's free markets. So I think that
Yes.
if
Mhm.
you want to support companies that are investing in the environment and it's hurting their profitability, like it's your money and there's not a single person who can tell you not to. If you want to invest in private prisons because they pay a dividend and you don't care about the ethics, it's like you can do that too. So I think really just trying to push the idea of like free markets with students and understanding. And then we
Yeah.
also end up saying that you should dollar cost average an index fund and don't deal with this anyway. But I think that's kind of, but we do say like, look, you can pick, it's your money. I think you could do whatever you want with
I think if you get down to that, that's great. The last question I have, sorry, I know you've got a hard stop.
it.
The last question is about data privacy. The big issue right now for parents is okay. The schools are using so many apps. I mean, they can't even take their kids' phones away anymore because it's like 17 apps on there. I have to use it for school. So I read through the policy. It's all FERPA compliant and everything, but the partners could sell the data about how they're using the tool, right? I mean, it might not have personal identifiers, but how does that work?
Yeah,
Can I
so
still
the partners can't sell any of the data. So
they can't. Okay.
right, the partners receive an aggregate summary. And for instance, like last year, we had probably 30,000 students in our national scholarship competitions. They receive a breakdown that says something like students from 48 states. They get a demographic of the students, which is extrapolated from, we have students' schools that they attend, and then we have the overarching school demographics. And so we assign that to the students and then extrapolate up. So
Okay.
aside from having like a snapshot of who participated, they don't actually get any of the personal data. And all we really require, we use students' school email addresses to verify their scholarship eligibility.
And in terms of how they're using it, though, like the way their pathway through and how fast they're learning things, or what kind of investment vehicles they're moving towards more than others. I mean, I would imagine they use some of that data to just, if I mean, I know to improve the curriculum itself, but do the partners want to see that in terms of like, oh, young people seem to be really interested in this kind of investment vehicle, or no?
We thought they did, to be fully candid. When we first started it was like, this would be great. Like if you could have 18-year-olds opinions on Snapchat before Snapchat reports earnings. And we didn't appreciate the lack of financial education in this country. And it's just such bad data. Because I mean, maybe after 2-3 years of using the platform, it's a lot better. But I think early on, at least, the data is a lot less meaningful because kids mostly go through the same, everyone buys an Apple, a Facebook, or a Nike. And so it's really just seeing how stocks move in that learning experience. We're not finding like the next biopharmaceutical stock in the data or whatnot. And so we don't share that with, the partners.
Okay. Because that's the big, that's the big issue. It's like, it's become almost boogeyman-like. And I mean, even I have been getting sucked into that, like EdTech, and I have to remind myself that it can be very, very bad, or it can be very, very wonderful. Like, it's like
Right.
there's a wide range. And I think where it comes down to, Brian, is that most people that I talk to are concerned about the government strings. They're concerned about anything good that you guys build and put into schools just being gobbled up and turned into something less good, or manipulated, or just poorly used even. Right.
Right.
So that it's like a false promise. Like you go in like, hey, we can teach your kids great stuff. And in the end, it's like, it isn't working, and somebody made and then people get bitter. They're like, oh, this company made a lot of money and our kids don't know anything. It's like, yeah, but is that the company's fault, or is that the implementation?
Right.
So, right. So do you have anything final that you'd like to tell the audience, mostly parents who are watching, about financial literacy or anything with their kids?
No, I mean, I think my parents got me started just picking stocks and following them when I was in 2nd or 3rd grade, I think. And just my parents, like investment banker, I just like followed Citibank. That was my stock. I was like, yeah, let's see. So I think just like becoming more familiar,
hilarious.
And, like, just immerse yourself and immerse your kids. And like, I think that it's fun learning alongside your kids in finance because no one has the right answers. So it's kind of like, and I think that honesty with your students of like, look, like, I don't understand all of this either. Otherwise, whatever. I think that's kind of fun with the kids.
But they can't, this is not really available for homeschoolers because the price point, like, it has to go into schools pretty much, right?
It seemed for currently, although we're kind of piloting launches with homeschools in April. So definitely kind of still looking.
Keep us posted, and we can let the homeschooling families know. But I'm grateful that you took the time to come in and explain what's going on with your product and with education. And like I said, the most important thing from my perspective is that you've given us a great picture of just the capital that's monopolized by having this giant system.
Right.
So thank you for that. That's a point of view we don't get very often. So I appreciate it. And I wish you the best of luck, and thank you so much for taking the time today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
No problem. Bye-bye.
All right. Have a good one.